Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to this STR teaching event. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Louisa Morse. I am Division Chair-elect this year of STR. And that means this year I'm working with Elisa Alvarez Garrido from the Executive Committee of STR and the Teaching Committee of STR. And the Teaching Committee consists of 8 dedicated members of STR who are working very hard for all of you to produce relevant content related to teaching and strategic management. And one of these events is this event here that Jenny and Cheng have organized. They're also planning another virtual event in the spring, so please keep an eye out on the STR website for more information about that. I'm very excited about this event today that Cheng Gao and Jennifer Kuan have put together, together with the support of Elisa. And I'm now going to hand over to them and they're going to introduce the event and our esteemed panelists. So please go ahead, Cheng and Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Louisa. And thank you also, Elisa, for all your help on this event. I'm Jenny Kuan, and I'm co-hosting this with Cheng. I am also really excited about this event. We have 2 books, 3 book authors here presenting, all prominent members of Academy and STR division. And what is, to me, the inspiration kind of for this topic and for this particular event was the way the authors, and you'll hear from them in a moment, use teaching as the impetus for their book writing work. And I think that as researchers, we don't talk enough about the role that teaching can play in our research, and in this case, we'll be talking about book length projects. So I'm really excited to hear about that from our speakers today. So I will let Cheng introduce our speakers so we can get moving and talk about, and they'll talk about. He'll talk about what the format of their remarks will be. Go ahead, Cheng. Thanks.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Jenny. So if you look at the slide here, so each panelist will talk about these 3 themes. We're going to start with Glenn and Jesper about their book, and then we're going to move to Tammy, and then there's going to be a Q&A afterwards. We're going to keep the introductions short, just so we have more time for our speakers. But in short, we're delighted to have 3 really distinguished scholars, teachers, and also academic leaders. So just briefly, Glenn Carroll is an Adams Distinguished Professor and former Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. His teaching includes MBA courses such as Organization for Strategic Advantage and Critical Analytical Thinking. He holds a PhD in Sociology from Stanford. And he also used to be a senior faculty member at Columbia Business School and Berkeley Haas. Tammy Madsen is the WM Keck Foundation Chair of Strategic Management and Innovation, and also the Senior Associate Dean of Faculty Research and Initiatives at the Levy School of Business at Santa Clara. Her strategy teaching includes the MBA capstone course on strategic analysis. She's also the Vice President-elect of the Academy of Management, so I believe she's going to be the President of the Academy of Management in around 3 years. She holds a PhD in Strategy and Organization from UCLA. And she started off her career as a test and evaluation engineer for the weapons control system of the F-14 aircraft, and also worked at Delco and GM. Last but not least, we have Jesper Sørensen, who is the Jeff Professor of Organizational Behavior and Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. His MBA courses on strategy include Strategic Leadership and Strategy and Management in Developing Economies. He holds a PhD in Sociology from Stanford University. And he's also the faculty director of the Stanford Institute for Innovation in Developing Economies, a big initiative also known as SEED. So these are just the really brief introductions of our wonderful panelists, and we'll pass it on to Glenn Carroll and Jesper Sørensen to start talking about their book, and then we'll go to Tammy after that. So Glenn, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me
and I'll stop my
share my slides here. So first of all, so thank you, Jennifer and Cheng, for organizing this. And thanks to everyone else for attending. It's really a great honor to be able to talk to you, especially in the rush before the holiday season, and to be able to talk about our book. So we're very happy to be able to do that. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and I'm going to turn it over to Jesper, and then we'll have Tammy, and then we'll have Q&A. So the question is, how did our book come about? And it's really a story about two cats. And if you knew me and Jesper, you would be very surprised by this because we're actually dog people. We each have 2 dogs. So there's a total of 4 dogs in our 2 families. So what are these cats? So they're not really these felines. They're 2 different kinds of cats. One is a course that we used to teach, a required MBA course for first years that we used to teach at the GSB called Critical Analytical Thinking, that was known as CAT. It was a small class where we had students write a paper. Their first quarter, they had to write a paper every week that developed some kind of argument or analyze an argument or communicate some kind of argument. So it was trying to get them to think critically. The course we thought was deeply needed, probably still is, but trying to get 14 instructors to coordinate proved almost impossible. So we no longer teach it, but it was a very meaningful experience. Part of the reason the course didn't do so well, I think, is because we didn't ever really figure out ways to tie it as closely as we should have to the academic business material that we were trying to teach the students at the same time. And that was always a sore point. I think our book was one attempt to try and do that. So that's the first cat. The second cat is about Caterpillar, the corporation. We used to run a pretty big executive education for Caterpillar, and Jesper and I were both centrally involved in that. And we actually taught critical analytical thinking as part of that executive education program. And people say, well, this, you'll never get executives to do this. We did, and they actually found it extremely valuable. And it was pretty much like what we were teaching the MBAs. At the same time, then, this was a year-long program, Jesper would come in and talk about strategy, and he was evolving in his thinking about, what really is strategy, and he was coming to the conclusion, it's basically an argument, and you need to be able to convince people of that argument. And then we realized one day in this factory here, you can see there in Chuzhou, China, it's in the middle of China where Caterpillar has a very big hex factory, that we actually ought to put these 2 things together, that we ought to find a way to use the materials about logical deduction and that we were teaching in critical analytical thinking to apply to strategy. And that then became the kind of origin of the book, and we worked on it for some years after that to try and develop the materials and make it work. Of course, it was also tied to stuff that was going on in the strategy, books here that I'm sure pretty much everybody in the audience knows. Rumel's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, where he talks about scientific approaches to strategy and hypothesis testing. The frustrating thing for me about Dick's book was that he's very good at criticizing and pointing out flaws in other people's attempts to do strategy in the business world in particular, but he didn't really offer a method for how to do it. Instead, he kind of proposed what to do, but he didn't tell you how to get there. And then, of course, Lafley and Martin and Todd Singer's books were very useful to us as well. So that's what created this book that is at Columbia Business School Press, been out a couple of years, and we've been teaching from since then. So I'd say if I had to say what's the underlying message of the book, it's what Jesper started with in his strategy teaching, which is that if you really think about what strategy is, it's basically an argument about how resources and actions fit together in a coherent and logically consistent way to produce a set of desirable outcomes. There are lots of reasons, lots of possible explanations for those outcomes. You never know for sure, but you're proposing a set of arguments that tells people this is how we got there and this is what we did to make it happen. And you never can be definitive about that, but you can be convincing. So the book tries to then develop 3 specific activities for doing that. And I think what we're trying to do here was that we're trying to do in the book is that we teach pretty, Jesper teaches more innovative stuff. I don't teach strategy that much anymore. But, historically, we've taught the same things everybody teaches in strategy. Porter's 5 forces, generic strategies, same cases, Walmart, Disney, The Economist, you name it. And, the lessons that people always take away from those cases in particular is like, well, yeah, I can see how Walmart works and why all these things fit together, or Southwest Air, and why this leads to a successful outcome. But what we were not teaching them was how you would develop those plans, how you would get there. What's the process by which a manager actually starts to think about a strategy and tinkers with it and develops it and comes up with the plan? So how do you think like Sam Walton rather than how do you be Walmart, just once it's fully developed? And the book works on this in 3 different ways. It starts with a set of visualization tools, or what we call strategy maps, and goes through some extended exercises on that. Then it moves to logical syllogisms and very simple, but for some people intimidating looking deductive arguments about what's happening to produce this outcome. And then the third leg is a kind of process inside the organization where you actually have a debate or an argument about what it is, and collectively kind of come to agreement or some understanding about what's working and not working in the strategy. So let me give you one example of the strategy mapping, then I'll turn it over to Jesper. And this is also from the book. So what's a strategy map? Well, it's a model, but it's a visual model, and it allows you to kind of think about how things fit together, but also to engage in counterfactual thinking. For most academics, it's a very simple thing. We do this all the time. We don't even often sketch them out. For students, though, our experience is this is actually a big breakthrough for many students because they've never actually gotten this systematic, and they never looked at it and had a way to discuss it that's meaningful and provides a forum for them to do it. So what is a strategy map? It's really just a causal diagram, box and arrow diagram of the arguments that shows you how to get the outcome you could. I'd say the one kind of surprising thing about what we suggest here for many people in the book is how to build these arguments. And I think we're conditioned by our high school mathematics classes, geometry in particular, to think, well, assume A, B, C, and D, therefore conclusion X arises. And in fact, that's the way arguments are presented. And people think, well, they worked on the assumptions first, and then they figured out what conclusion led to. In fact, if you talk to mathematicians, scientists, lots of people who do this kind of thing, they do it in the reverse. They have some kind of insight, and or they have a hunch, and they say, here's what I think is going on, and here's the outcome. They start with the outcome, and then they work backwards to try and figure out what are the set of causes and factors that produce that outcome, and try and develop that into an argument that looks like it could produce the outcome. So here's one we have in the book. I'll briefly run through this and then turn it over to Jesper. So this is about Southwest Airlines, a case everybody's very familiar with. And I should say the book is intentionally uncreative in the cases it uses. We wanted to produce a book that would work for most strategy instructors. So we stuck to a lot of the cases that almost everybody uses, like Southwest, Walmart, and the like. And so what's the conclusion you start with Southwest? Well, you start with the idea that they have a low-cost strategic advantage, and that's the outcome you're trying to explain. That's the strategy result. You could get into the financials of that, but that seems to kind of be beside the point for most strategy classes. How does Southwest do that? Well, we could talk about this, but at least our understanding of it is they are very, very good at using their airplanes and their people. So capacity utilization is very high. And a big part of that is their very rapid turnaround times. So they have the fastest turnaround times of anybody in the industry. They also have lower variable costs as a result. They lower staffing levels. And a big part of that is from the HR system, which has teamwork, especially at the gate when they're trying to board, so that people, no matter what their roles, and even with all the unions involved, they will do what needs to be done, including stepping outside the role and doing stuff in order to get the plane filled, in order to get it off on time. And so the story in the book is about how a few years ago, when all the other airlines started adding extra costs for baggage and for advanced seating assignments and all of this, and Southwest CEO Gary Kelly was under a huge amount of pressure to do that for Southwest because their profits were dipping for a point, and he refused to do it. And it was thought that was kind of crazy. He was leaving money on the table. And so we try to work through in the book why he would refuse to do it. And it had to do, at least our understanding of it, had to do with him thinking that this would undermine this whole system here that we have set up here. How would it undermine it? Well, if you go to assigned seating, let's say, all of a sudden here now you're going to get all kinds of requests at the gate. So people are going to line up and ask to be reassigned and all this stuff. And it's going to slow down the boarding times. And when it does that, it's going to affect first teamwork, because not everybody can reassign them. You have to know how to go into the computer and do all this stuff. And it's also going to slow people down to get on the plane, because you're no longer going to be able get everybody there as quick as you can because they're going to be standing in line. And so those two things, even though they seem very simple and would add revenue, in fact, looked like they were going to undermine some core aspects of the strategy itself. And, at least we think he resisted them for those reasons and that he was right to do so. And, and then they turned that into a marketing campaign later about how they were not nickel and diming their customers like every other airlines. And needless to say, Southwest is still doing pretty well these days. Jesper, you want to take it from here? I will.
Sure. So can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about, I think, what is perhaps in some ways, I think this is the most quixotic part of the book, where we actually try to introduce some principles of formal logic into this. But I think if you take the premise seriously that a strategy is a causal argument for how you're going to win, then if you take the argument part of that seriously, you should be also believing that there's some value in being disciplined in how you evaluate the logic. So one way to think about this is the mapping that Glenn talked about. I think that's incredibly valuable. And I think one of the things that we kind of realized as we were writing the book is that, this is something that I'm sure all of us on this call do kind of quite routinely, right? Like we do it in our own work, certainly when we do research, right? When we're thinking about our ideas and how they're related to each other, we'll get up on a whiteboard and we'll draw boxes and arrows and so on and so forth. But we also, like I've oftentimes had that experience, because I do it a lot when I teach cases. I've always done that a lot when I taught cases, right? At the end of the day, there's a logic loop up on the board, and you have this experience then students coming up to you and saying, "Oh my God, that was so like that clarified things so much," right? And one of the things that we realized in writing the book was that we don't ever teach the students how to do that part. Right. And so now, of course, that's good for our employment because that makes it seem like we have some secret sauce that none of them have. Right. But the truth is they can really benefit from that. And I think both students and executives really, value that, and they and thinking about a disciplined way of doing that. Now, the problem with mapping is kind of twofold. So mapping is most well suited for retrospective analysis. So that's why it goes so well with cases, right? So it's, in other words, because you have all the data and you can do things like that. But also mapping is dangerous. And because it's very prone to put it bluntly, it's a little early in the morning here, but it's very prone to bullshit, right? So, and in the sense that it's very easy to draw boxes and arrows and draw connections between them. And we've all seen PowerPoint slides like that, where there's some sort of virtuous cycle that immediately accelerates, and suddenly we've got the hockey stick growth and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do you have a disciplined way of thinking about this, especially in the context of strategy formulation, right? So where the reason you can be more rigorous and more disciplined, and the reason mapping seems to work better for kind of established cases, is because you kind of know what the facts are, right? But when you're doing strategy formulation, you don't know what the facts are because it's about the future, and the future hasn't happened yet. So, right, what's the density of charging stations going to be in Copenhagen in 2035? Like, who knows, right? Like, that depends on all kinds of variables, but that obviously has really important implications for an electric vehicle manufacturer who wants to sell into that market, right? And so if you want to formulate a strategy, they got to make assumptions. And of course, assumptions are tricky because they might not be true, right? And so, and kind of our observation of how strategy happens in many organizations is when they're doing strategy formulation, they spend a lot of time fighting, but what they're fighting about is the truth of the assumptions, right? They're fighting about whether or not the density of charging stations is really going to be this high or not. But what they don't spend a lot of time fighting about is whether it even matters, right? And so this is where kind of formal logic really comes in, right? And so, because what we draw on is a very simple idea that I think we're all familiar with, which is the distinction between a logically valid argument, in other words, one that is internally coherent. Maybe you can go to a couple of slides forward, Glenn, if you could. this one, right? So a logically valid argument is one that's internally consistent, okay? So I'm going to give you a set of assumptions. You might think those assumptions are crazy, but you have to stipulate to the truth to those assumptions. And then what I'm going to assess is whether or not the conclusion follows from those assumptions, assuming that those assumptions are true. Okay, so I might have totally wild and crazy kind of assumptions in there, but if I assume that those assumptions are true, then does the conclusion follow? And we can think about lots of, right, so a lot of what happens, some of the slides we skipped over there, right, are really just making a point that a lot of what we do in business and a lot of the people we teach are doing in business, they are making informal arguments. And what that means is they're kind of not stating all of their assumptions, okay? And so that means that they're actually not, from a formal perspective, logically coherent. Now, why does that matter? It matters partly, for elegance reasons, but really the reason it matters is because we want to know what assumptions we're making. Okay, and so validity is a very useful tool for assessing whether or not we have actually identified what are all the implicit assumptions that we have made in our strategy. Now, there's another way to assess an argument, which is about the truth of the assumptions, okay, which is the external consistency of the argument, okay? And the intersection of internally consistent and externally consistency is what we call a sound argument, right? So there's a valid argument, which is, does the conclusion follow from the assumptions as stated? And then a sound argument is it valid? Plus, are the assumptions true? Now, if you think about that in the context of, you can move forward, Glenn. If you think about this in the context of strategy, what is that? Whoops, one more back. So there you go. Right? If you think about this, like my saying for this is validity today, soundness tomorrow. Okay. Now, what does that mean? When you're formulating strategy, what you can assess today is whether or not your argument is valid. Okay. You can't assess whether or not your assumption about what the density of charging stations in 2035 is going to be you can't assess the truth of that because it's not 2035 yet. Right. And so we have to make some bets, right? And that's what's so exciting, of course, about strategy is making those bets. But what you can assess is whether or not you have identified all the assumptions that are required to make that conclusion come true and whether they combine in a logically consistent way. And once you start to do that, then you get kind of other benefits too, because you can start to identify what are the critical assumptions, et cetera, and the things that you really have to pay attention to. But in some sense, the first order concern here is just simply knowing, like, if my assumptions are true, is it even possible that the outcome that I want is going to happen? Okay, and so the soundness tomorrow is what that means is that you're going to discover tomorrow whether or not those assumptions are true. Now, there's a whole nother layer to this, of course, which is strategy isn't set it and forget it, and you have to be then iterating around the adjustments to your strategy, but having this model, right? Just like we do as scientists, right? We think about my theory of what's going on is this. I'm going to go run an experiment. I'm going to learn some things are confirmed, some things are not confirmed. I'm going to update my theory. I'm going to go on like that. That's really how we think about what the strategy process is like in the book. So, okay, I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Glenn and Jesper, for this very fascinating overview of your argument-based view of strategy and strategy formulation. So next up, we have Tammy Madsen. So Tammy, feel free to share your slides and the floor is yours. Tammy, I think you're on mute.
You're muted, Tammy.
Tend to always do that. Sorry, thank you. Okay, so I put up this slide because it has an image of my co-author, David Cruikshank, who is the Vice President of DevOps and Multi-Cloud at SAP. And he's one of the reasons why this journey started. So let me head to that part of the process, this intersection between sort of teaching, practice, and research. David was working on his master's at MS in IS at Santa Clara at the business school. but he had a different kind of projects that he wanted to pursue for his thesis. So the head of that program was sort of looking for someone that was doing work in strategy and innovation and could work with David. David at the time was directing a co-innovation enablement lab at SAP in Palo Alto. And he wanted to focus his thesis on that project and sort of trying to sort out what it was. Is it a platform? Is it something else? So we went down this journey that led to a paper, conference presentations, ongoing dialogue and development. He would stop by my office. We had lots of conversations. David's an amazing storyteller, but neither one of us were satisfied, and I in particular wasn't satisfied about how this fit in within the existing sort of body of literature. And, over the last 15 years, there's been this kind of growth spurt of empirical work on platforms. There's been certainly a large spurt of large amount of ecosystem work coming out, and the model just didn't seem to fit within those categories that were emerging. So I want to go back to the data. The paper itself was a qualitative paper, which no problems with qualitative work, but it's not my sweet spot. It's not my sort of comfort zone. So can we get some more data? So this is about, I guess, 7 years after we started the conversation. And we took a deeper dive into a subset of projects, 250 projects, because now there are 15 of these platforms across the world. We had a lot of interviews with co-innovation partners trying to understand why they were even engaging with this platform. What were they doing? What value did they gain? What did they learn? Iteration on the model, back and forth between theory and practice, and then getting feedback from a variety of audiences, MBA, executive MBA, and execs, and next steps. Well, should it be an article? Do we want to try to carve that out? What will we lose by doing so? A book seemed to be a better fit given sort of some of the rich stories. We thought that we were sort of losing parts of what we wanted, the story we wanted to tell. So what's the core idea, right? The focus is really on building a generative ecosystem. And for us, my roots are back with Bill McKelvey and evolutionary ecology. So I see that as kind of speaking through 3 types of activities. Mobilizing different types of actors, and we need that diversity of knowledge to facilitate new generation of knowledge, new knowledge creation, enabling interactions among a whole host of loosely connected actors to collaborate, to problem solve, to try to accelerate development through these interactions. And the last piece is facilitating joint learning so that you continue to grow the system, the actors are evolving their capabilities, and that continues to help to produce new output in the ecosystem. So that was kind of the heart of what we were interested in. And what we're interested in doing. And the model is a little bit like this. So starts off with a couple partners. They want to develop a project. They can't complete that project. Their organization, they may have resource constraints or time constraints, or it's not getting priority. They come to the platform with a proposal, and the platform approves the proposal and then allocates a whole set of resources, not just digital toolkits, but physical and digital resources. So it's much more of a hands-on kind of model. So supply side, demand side type activities. They then help them form, execute, and launch the outcomes of that partnership relationship, and the value that's created is captured by the partners, distributed to their customers, but also the platform indirectly benefits. Because of this value distribution, this kind of equitable value distribution, and the resource open nature of the platform, it tends to attract a lot of high quality participants. But here in the context of strategy, the story is not about building this massive volume of complementers. This is not an iOS platform or Android. And this is one of the reasons why it didn't seem to fit within the traditional kind of models that we were seeing. So if you look on the left-hand side, that's the set of services that the platform provides. Starting from an IT landscape, there's a knowledge broker. If you're working on a project and you're lacking subject matter expertise or a piece of technology, the knowledge broker will go out and help you find that. There's an operations management team that runs the show, helps all the project teams engage their work and get their work done. But they also play a role of sort of orchestrating the ecosystem. And there's contract, protect and manage, legal services, and then finally a demo and showcase, which is really about marketing and launching that project. So resource open, as opposed to sort of resource closed, like a traditional kind of eBay model, if you will, or transaction platform model. We're not that. And much more of a hands-on approach as opposed to a hands-off approach. One of the things that is part of this is a mindset of kind of being open to innovation. And so the notion being working with the platform as opposed to for the platform. We try to read that throughout throughout the book. What's the territory that's covered? We cover a variety of territories. I know there's a lot of content on this slide. I think the idea here is that we have cases from dairy cooperative in the Black Forest that wants to be able to figure out how do we use digital twin technology to provide better information to our consumers about the products that's on the shelf, to zero harm products and projects on zero harm mining, where we're trying to sort of help a mine figure out ways to reduce the harm to their miners by using IoT, edge computing, centralized intelligence system. And what you're seeing on the bottom here are 2 images of demos as part of that demo and launch type activity, where it's a mining demo, which has a bunch of sensors in it, Wi-Fi technology. There's even an elevator in there. Little orange dots are miners, right, that have watches on them that have also sensors. So all of this is used to sort of test out some ideas quickly. Most of these projects are short term, but they span a whole variety of industries and a whole variety of technologies. A core piece of the book is building, how do you build this thing? What do you do, right? So what, why, and how. And part of that is also getting at this notion of value distribution. So we include the value minus cost framework within the context of a platform, where who's capturing what value. And then core innovation storytelling. So, you know, beyond just demos, there's a whole variety of ways to sort of storytell around these projects. And whether it's videos, we held an IoT symposium at SAP, a whole set of things that we can do to try to launch them out into the community, into the ecosystem. And we conclude with a story about what next steps, what's going to happen with co-innovation going forward, and some stories about, well, in the digital and cloud-based transformation space, what can we do? David certainly is an expert in the cloud space. He's currently working on co-innovation projects in that area. There's an appendix with a ton of mini cases, and some of these cases are strewn throughout the book as examples, but they use a variety of technologies from AI, machine learning, edge computing, IoT, a whole host of different kinds of things. All right, so this is not working this morning. How do we make it actionable? How do we use this information in the classroom? Where do we start? And I think the starting point is, you know, if you've ever been in a classroom, sort of a student says, well, let's make it an ecosystem play. And I always say, oh, really? Dude, tell me more about that, because there usually isn't any legs to that story. So try to get them to step back and kind of ask the classic question in strategy is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the opportunity you're trying to address? Do you need an ecosystem? Do you need a platform? What's it look like? Who are the complementers and partners in that space? What roles do they play? What roles will you play? What's the purpose of your initiative? And then finally, how are you going to design it? If you're going to design a platform, how will you manage it? What will be used for? What are all the key parts? How will you govern it? So that's sort of part of our starting points. In the context of courses, I use this content in my strategic analysis course, the strategic management course, you know, this notion of ecosystems versus industries. And I think the ecosystem blends throughout the course in terms of touch points. It's applied in the context of value minus cost framework, thinking about how do we distribute value, how do we create that value, and then who captures what. And then finally, in the collaboration for innovation. So one of the challenges is any of these projects coming into the platform, they're not just startups. We're talking about large or medium or small organizations. So it might be Intel working with a medium-sized organization, or Cisco. And you know, a lot of these companies come in with, oh, well, we have our traditional contract process, which could take 3 months to work through. And that's not going to work if the project's only intended to be 3 or 6 months. So there's a lot of time spent sort of figuring out how do we get them to sort of agree to, a simple contract, a simple frame agreement, and all that about helping them manage frictions in that process. So developing that mutual understanding so that the collaboration can move forward and accelerate the innovation. In strategic innovation courses, the focus is much more about ecosystem strategy, the what and how of that element, and strategic activities that are focused on generativity. So how do you do this? So if you are sort of enabling complementers, well, so what else? How do you ensure that there's some kind of outcome from that that's productive for the ecosystem? And then I think about it as one of the corporate innovation vehicles that we talk about in these courses, just complementing many of the other types of corporate innovation vehicles, because what I see is many firms are saying, well, we can make a platform play, but they don't need a platform, right? Not in the sense of a two-sided platform like iOS or Android or one of the other typical platforms, the transaction platform that we might see. They do need a way to accelerate innovation. And so for them, it's a question about, well, should I create sort of this innovation platform, or should I engage with a co-innovation platform that's external to my organization? And how do I go about doing that? And then we spend some time thinking about co-innovation's behavior and shifting your mindset to, you have to go outside. It's really sort of hard to do this alone and keep pace with the pace of innovation in multiple contexts. In platform sessions, I'm spending a lot more time thinking about differences between different types of forms of platforms, right? So hands off, hands on, how do they parse out? What are the underlying dimensions here that would shift? And then more importantly, how do you govern it? We hear a lot about orchestration, but there tends to be a little bit of fluffiness in some of those areas of orchestration. So can we get them to sort of be very clear about what are the roles, what are the activities? There's a couple cases that I use where I do an A case and I send them off, and the B case is like, well, the firm wants to develop an innovation platform. What are they going to do? What steps should they take? What are the strategic benefits? What are the organizational benefits, and so on? And then some time based on co-innovation storytelling. So how do you communicate that information downstream? And that's it. I've been trying to be short and quick so we have time for Q&A.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tammy, for this fascinating overview of your book on co-innovation. I'm going to turn it over now to Jenny to moderate the Q&A portion of this event now.
Right. Thanks, Chang. And thank you, Tammy, for that really quick overview of what is a really big and deep topic. And also Glenn and Jesper for your really good and quick overview of your book and how it came about through your teaching and so on. So we now have time for some questions. If you can use the raise your hand with the reaction buttons, then I will be able to see you. And I have some questions also to start off with, while other people are working on their own questions. If I don't want to jump in front of anyone though. Tammy, sorry, go ahead, Cheng.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start off with a question. Sure. This is more of a practical or logistical question, but I was wondering if each of the panelists can talk about how you incorporate the book into teaching, because we're all used to sort of teaching with cases. There's a teaching note. If you want to incorporate ideas from a book, do you assign a chapter, then do you pair it with a case, or like what are some logistical advice you have for doing that? Because there's been a lot of strategy books in general. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. So I've been using my book in my kind of strategy course. It's a kind of a quasi-core strategy course, and the way I do it is I basically devote a session to mapping, and so what I have them do is I have them read a case in advance, and then I assign the chapter on mapping from the book. And what we do, so I do a couple of, it's taken me time to kind of figure out how to do this, right? Especially with MBAs. What I do kind of, one way to put it is I pre-digest the case a little bit for them. So in other words, I give them kind of like my take on what why did Shimano succeed, for example, or why did Carmack succeed or something like that. And then what we do is the first thing we do is the question isn't that broad usually, but then the first part of the class is basically doing the mapping together. So kind of like a more traditional case discussion, but kind of having first kind of talked a little bit about mapping and why that's important and so on and so forth. And then I have them work in small groups where they then take a different conclusion, right? And are asked to come up with a reason why, right? So like I use Shimano because I've taught that for a long time, right? So one is like, why do they have a perceived quality advantage? And that's the one we do together. And then why do they have a bargaining advantage over their buyers, right? And that's the one they do in groups, right? And that part is actually really powerful because by doing it in small groups, they come up with each group comes up with a map. And then what I usually do is I have them share, right? I have groups pair up and share their maps with each other, because I actually think one of the powerful things about mapping is that it surfaces people's different mental models, right? And so then they see how their maps are different, and then they can have a discussion about whether, what each of them missed or what kinds of things that they did and so on and so forth. And then we kind of come back and do kind of a closing kind of aggregation like that.
Yes, I would just add a little bit to that. So we've heard from a number of people who've used parts of the book in their classes, both undergraduate and MBA. And I think probably, yes, Brian, if you agree, that the mapping part of it is definitely resonates easier and better with the students, and the kind of exercise Jesper is describing seems to go pretty well. So Ulrike Schade at the UCSD Global Schools use it with undergraduates. Oscar-John Koschak at Emory is used it with undergraduates. And John DeFigueredo is used it with MBAs and undergraduates at Duke. And so that, that works pretty well. It's kind of like the first time you walk them through it, but then you give them a problem and they're able to, in small groups, go off and create these maps. And then they do like discussing them later. We've also done this with executives. Yes, we're not together, executive education, where, we'll have a session of 80 minutes and then we'll explain all this. And then we'll break something out with a question and give them 10 minutes in a small group to create a map. And they usually do it and come back and, then we have a little discussion about it. And that's usually pretty interesting as well. They're, of course, much faster and more sophisticated, but their maps aren't always great either. So they learn from it as well. I think we've had less luck with the logical deduction part of it. I think you probably need a longer class or something to get people to work on that. And you probably need to teach them a little more logic up front or refresh their logic to make that work. Then the mapping is just more intuitive, it seems like.
I tend to use, so it depends on the audience, right? So for my executive MBA classes, I'll include the book, but I also have them look at multiple other books in that context, right? And other articles. But I think what's useful is sort of, in particular, some of these concepts, there's a lot of jargon usage, right? A lot of fluff. And can we remove that and get a better understanding of exactly what this concept means, how it can be useful, under what conditions it can be useful. And so we'll start out with, okay, what is an ecosystem? You're talking about it all the time. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to your organization? But what truly is it? Or maybe you're not actually really talking about an ecosystem. Maybe you're just talking about an industry, right? So, so trying to nail down that, and that, I think that kind of conversation can be done by sort of giving them a couple short, brief articles on a variety of companies and saying, okay, go out and define what we would think their ecosystem is, or send them off and say, well, the auto industry is morphed into mobility ecosystem. Who are all the players? What role do they play? Who controls this? Does anyone make a difference? How do the firms strategize around this system to ensure that they are accelerating innovation and they're improving their own while also helping to collaborate with others that are lifting the boats for all, right? So that's one chunk. Another piece is that I'll send them off with a case. There's I think Leontic, there's a series of cases there. And the first case is really sort of the history of that company coming into to Google and then a spin out. And but between the first, I think, and the second case, there's this notion of, well, should we develop a platform? What should that be? And so I'll give them first case, and then in a class exercise in a team format, send them off and say, okay, if they're going to develop a platform, what should it look like? What should be the key elements of it? How should they govern it? What kind of decisions need to be made around those elements? And so that can be done with any type of case, or you can give them a simple problem to solve in that category. And I think that's forcing them to sort of identify the key governance mechanisms and what kinds of decisions have, what kind of implications those decisions have, starts to sort of light up where, like, oh, I don't really need this for my company, but it might be really important for me to develop collaboration skills because I'm going to need to collaborate with a variety of partners, but I might not need to be the platform sponsor, right? So sort of starting to get them thinking about these terms in a very critical way and sort of trying to move away from just using them in a fluffy manner. But really, it kind of goes back to, under what conditions does it make sense to develop a platform yourself? Do you need to be a partner in that engagement, or do you need to be a sponsor? And then separately on the ecosystem, what roles are being played? And I've tested this content out with not just, sort of variety of MBAs, some undergraduate content, but also largely a variety of executive audiences. And I think the piece where in those contexts, we spend a lot more time talking about well, this ecosystem spot, how can you leverage it to accelerate innovation in your organization? And I think in our interviews with a variety of co-innovation partners, some of the things that struck them was like, well, we came in with our team and we left with better innovation skills. So it was less about truly the solution they developed and more about the massive amount of learning they gained while they were in that engagement. And those views came from, very large organizations within the Valley that were expressing this. And so it was quite surprising to us. The second element that was really surprising that we found was that there was repeated engagement. So they'd come in and do one project, and they might interact with someone else and sort of learn, oh, this other sort of project they're working on, this technology, that might lead, that'll foster a collaboration between a new network tie between two parties. And then that leads to some new project that's not on their roadmap that now is taking a role and playing a priority on the roadmap. So there's other pieces to the story that pop out. I think ultimately trying to always bring it back to strategy, right? So what are the strategic elements here that matter?
Great, thank you. That was very helpful.
Great. Do we have other questions before I ask mine? Oh, good. Hakan, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Jesper, and thank you, Glenn. These are excellent books, and I'm going to look for a way to incorporate them into my teaching. What I want to ask you about is, as a person who is thinking about writing a book too, I want to ask you, to what extent have you written about why these companies did the things they did from your own perspective versus giving those executives a voice and saying why they say they did those things in those companies? So for example, the Southwest Airlines example that Glenn was explaining. So Glenn said, why did they refuse the idea of charging for a seat upgrade or seat assignment? I believe that's what he said. And Glenn said, we believe it made sense because it was good for teamwork at the gate. Whereas later on, the company, in explaining that to the public, they said, we don't want to nickel and dime our customers. So there seems to be some sort of alternative interpretation there. And obviously the same decision could be explained in multiple ways. So my question is, to what extent are you reporting on the executive's own thought process? And this question is for Tammy too, by the way. And to what extent are you interpreting the decisions they made in your books?
So
yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's a great question. We're quite clear in the book that we're trying to illustrate the methods, right? So the analytical methods, and we're not trying. We say quite clearly in the book, that we don't know why they reached the decision. We also don't know why they communicated the decision in which they did. I used to, when I was at MIT, I used to teach with Bob Gibbons, and he used to say cases are poetry, right? And, in the sense that, we use them for many purposes and for many different, and so that's really how we're doing it. I mean, you could certainly write a very different kind of book, which is really trying to understand what went on, right? And what was and I think those books are incredibly important too. And Glenn and I have read a lot of those kinds of articles and stories, et cetera, as a way of trying to understand how these processes play out. But the book is really about the mapping, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we didn't. I mean, the one exception in the book is the case we illustrate about The Economist. I actually did have one of the Economist editors come to class and heard his story. But again, I don't know. He's telling the story he wants to tell the class, just like a Southwest marketing story. Is there such? Who knows if that's the real reason? Those are important things to find out. Book doesn't do that and doesn't try to do that. One of our justifications for that, as Jesper said, is to illustrate the method. But the other one is that, imagine you're a competitor. We give an example of Apple Music in the book when it started. So imagine you're Spotify or one of the competitors, and Apple puts out, their music store to begin with. What do you want to try and figure out what they're doing and why? And so they're not going to tell you that. but you maybe want to build a map of several maps about here's the possibilities and here's how we might counter them, and that would be useful, we think, even though you would never actually get to the real answer. But your question's a good one. Thank you.
It's a good question. And just to add on, I mean, our intentions were normative, not positive, right? So like, we're trying to say, this is how we think you should think about and go about doing strategy. We're not trying to say, this is what really happened that drives Southwest's success, right? Which is also important, of course, as scientists, the positive part is also important.
I think our work is grounded in certainly a strong grounding in sort of the cases, the project cases, as well as the interviews and sort of all of this qualitative data, right? Certainly informs how the model sort of emerged and certain elements were added into the model over time. But then that is iterated with theory, right? So that also informed David as they were evolving the lab model at SAP, sort of then evolving it more to a platform model and then instituting elements in that model to sort of shape it. So I think it has kind of both pieces, but we certainly are the voice of the manager, the voice of the partner is here and certainly telling us, well, here's kind of where we stumbled in a case, here's where there are failures in a case, because not all the co-innovation projects are successful, right? So where was there a hang up? Where was there a pain point that something fell apart? And oftentimes it really ends up being about the breakdown of mutual understanding and mutual trust, right? Which is not surprising in partnership relationships, particularly if it's in an innovation category. But the flip side is sort of, all the different elements that came out of what they learned by just even engaging in one project, which were certainly surprising to us that we sort of didn't anticipate, right? So I think it's the beauty of both pieces, but certainly their voice is in the story, as is the voice of the literature on ecosystems and platforms.
Thank you, Hakan, for the question. Do we have another? I think we have about enough time for one more question, if there is one. If not, I have a question and comment, I guess. I'm really impressed by how complementary these two books were. I hadn't thought about that coming in, but I'm sensing a theme, which is logic and rigor. And so you both talked about that. I think what's nice about Tammy's book is that, working so closely with a practitioner, you're getting at Hakan's question of, like, what were they actually thinking at the time? And that's a nice kind of compliment to bring. But, you also have talked about, Glenn and Jesper, about how hard it is to operationalize, into in-class exercises, bringing in the logic and the rigor that is sort of part of the purpose of the book. And I guess I'm wondering if you can say something about that and that critical thinking, and in terms of like successes that you've had in promoting that in the classroom, as hard as it is, because sometimes, and it's not surprising for a group of academics that we would focus on that, but it sometimes feels overly academic, and yet it's really, really important, right? So big mistakes happen if you don't apply that. So I don't know if you have some thoughts on that. Jesper, you're nodding, so go ahead, give us your thoughts on that.
I have thoughts on everything. So that's a great question. I mean, I think, well, so I would say, first of all, like teaching to executives, I often have had this experience of teaching to executives of, engineering-led companies, right? And who are the high level of executives in an engineering-led company? They're oftentimes engineers, right? Who kind of got punished by being good at something and therefore got promoted to management. And so if you tell them, look, actually good strategy is about like being able to think in a logically consistent way, they're like, oh my God, thank you. Right? Because like they're coming from a world where logic and discipline was what they were about, right? Like, so they were doing software engineering or whatever, right? And so now suddenly, and then they got into management and they're like, it's all, blah, blah, blah. So, and I think the insight there actually is what people struggle with, and I think MBA students struggle with as well, which I think is something that we as academics are much better at, for whatever reason, either aptitude or training, is abstraction and thinking conceptually, right? And I think that ties to some of what Tammy was saying earlier as well, right? Like they, our executives and our MBA students in particular are very concrete thinkers, right? And so then trying to kind of lift up and kind of be more abstract is a real challenge, right? And so that, I think, is where, if we can help them with that, I think that helps a lot, right? And I think that's kind of implicit in how we teach, right? But I think sometimes being more self-conscious about that could be really helpful.
I think that's exactly, I mean, we spend time in the book sort of talking about abstracting away complexity, right? Trying to sort of pull apart all the sort of layers on top that are sort of blinding us to what really is at the core of the issue, or the core of sort of how to manage something. So it's spot on, yeah.
The other thing we found is that with companies, but also with our MBAs, because they want to be nice to each other, is they're kind of shocked by our idea that you should argue about things. Because they view an argument, people in companies often view argument as a fight and counterproductive, and let's not go there, I want a positive win-win thing. And so, you have to teach them that, arguments are different than fights, and a good logical argument is actually a healthy thing.
Yeah.
But that's not natural to business people in many realms, and especially in big companies. As again, our MBAs, it's not natural to them either in the classroom.
That's fantastic. Well, I think we're just about out of time, so I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Glenn, Tammy, and Jesper, for all of your time and your insights and sharing your experience and your books, your teaching and research with us. And Cheng, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts as well.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Screenshot. Michael wants a screenshot.
Louise wants a screenshot, if you don't mind.
Let's do
it would be great if we could get everyone just to put on their cameras briefly, and then Elisa's going to do a screenshot of us so we can advertise the event.
And thank you, Jenny and Cheng, for all of your work on this event.
Yeah,
Really
thank you for organizing it. Yeah.
Well, thank you,
all
Lisa,
for
and Louise,
participating
and
and
Michael.
organizing.
Of course. Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Oh, they're disappearing fast.
He's gone.
Good. We're
Thank
done.
you, Louise and Elisa as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you to the STR division for all your support.
All right.
Thank you,
Yes,
everyone.
absolutely.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a nice holiday.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.